little bit about what I've seen happen to people who talk about empowerment, who talk strongly about how they feel about their land, their issues, how their political well-being affects their day-to-day well-being. Because in my life, figures that I've respected, people that have stood up, and taken a hard-line position on anything, have always been affected on their personal side. And we've seen that in the course of history, because colonialists, capitalists just tend to grind down on people who stand up for themselves, who stand up for their rights, who stand up for anything that they believe in. We began a group called the Native Youth Movement. And Native Youth Movement began right here in East Vancouver. And it grew kind of organically. There was no resolution, there was no annual general assembly or anything like that. But we grew out of a really big need, because our leaders of the day, Bill Erasmus in particular, was the leader of the Assembly of First Nations. And he always talked the big talk about youth. And there was a particular belief at some point, and it was kind of a pan-Indian thought that this seventh generation kind of thing was supposed to take effect. And in a lot of his speeches to government, he'd always warn the government that, we're coming up with a generation that's not going to take any more of your bullshit. And it was kind of ironic, because you look around the room and there'd be no youth in the room. So on one hand, they talked about this kind of specter of youth standing up and organizing and mobilizing and contributing to the cause, and yet there was just absolutely no groundwork being done. And we see this in the course of the development of all kinds of band council produced initiatives. And growing up in Eastside, we'd come to a meeting like this, and you'd hear all kinds of talk about the seventh generation and the young people, and we wouldn't see any young people in the meetings. So there was one particular meeting at the Friendship Center where they were talking about youth again, and I got up and I said, well, there's nobody else under 30, and it turned out there was. It was going to be my friend Sean John. He's been a friend for life, and I saw him at the corner of the room, and we started talking. We just talked basically about our story. And one thing you know about Native people is that everybody's got a story. And that story is about how they grew up, whether they're in foster homes, whether they're affected by sexual abuse, whether they're affected by residential school, whether they're affected by a prison system, whether they're affected by the numerous health statistics that are always inundated when you talk about Native people. So everybody can see on that eye-to-eye level fundamentally, and especially young people, because they're not really clouded by agendas. It's just basically about understanding each other's story and creating solidarity on that basis. So, like all things, you've got to really struggle to make things happen on the ground. And so we made that commitment that we weren't going to take no for an answer, and so we literally just accosted youth as they're walking up and down Commercial Drive. And pretty soon people, after a while say, yeah, I feel the same way too. And over the course of the next 6 months, it went from 3 people to maybe about twice the size of this room to, 150 people, 200 people sometimes at some of the events that we were organizing and coordinating. And of course, all of this was aimless political stuff. It wasn't really grounded in any type of philosophy. It was just basically Native people coming together to understand each other. And I think that had a power into it that nothing that, if you try to organize it today, can reproduce that. And we were able to accomplish a lot of things and lay the groundwork for a lot of things that are happening in the community today. And it's not that we take credit for the resistance that's going on today, but I think if you kind of take a look at the course of history as it relates to Indigenous people, we've got an unbroken chain of resistance all the way back to the Mayflower, all the way back to Plymouth Rock. Whether you look at the American Indian movement, whether you look at our brothers and sisters down Geronimo, for example, all the way down throughout the course of history, every 50 or 60 years, there's a resistance group that is born out of the people. And in my generation, we were lucky enough that we had older people from the American Indian movement. And so in the course of being a part of the Native Youth Movement, we basically started to understand what's going on in our community by informing one another. And the same setup that happened here tonight, we touched on language, we touched on all of these things that haven't really changed very much in the last 20 or 30 years. And we started to talk about those frustrations, and we began to understand that it's not manifested out of thin air. It's an actual process. And that's when we began to really understand what colonization is about. Colonization for Indigenous people is about displacing people's land. And in order to displace people's land, you have to destroy their culture and destroy their political will. And in my lifetime, in protests that I've been at, whether it's been in Burnt Church or in GM or in Caledonia, you can see the might and power of the Canadian state. And when they employ their tactics, when they use RCMP, when they use the intelligence system to grind down on the people that are resisting, it's about colonization. It's about neo-colonization. I think the number one thing that colonization does, it removes our political will to understand that we can do it for ourselves. We went to a treaty meeting in North Vancouver. It was supposed to be the hallmark of it was supposed to be the new and improved treaty process. We went in there, maybe 30 of us youth, and it was ironic because we came in there with drums, we were singing songs, and all of the chiefs stood up in respect for us, and they made an agreement with us that if we leave, they let us read off 3 statements. And so they basically got through the first statement, which was the treaty process is a sham. The treaty process is not for our people. The treaty process is about developing us into municipal governments. The treaty process is about extinguishment. And right about the time when we said treaty process is extinguishment, they cut the mics off. And so we just went bananas, right? So all of the youth were yelling, and the elders were yelling at us. And you got to erase this whole thing in your head that Native people are humble, patient people with one another and pious and all those other kind of images that are produced about Native people. No, when it comes down to it, we're just as nasty as the next group, and we were just throwing insults at one another. And the thing that we learned about that process is that there are forces out there that want to protect colonization on our side too. And that was something really profound in my life to understand, that no matter how nice a person is, and this is where it gets tricky for our people, because we've got a lot of people in the treaty process that promote the Aboriginal agenda that are genuine people. In fact, you'll see them at potlatches, you'll see them at cultural ceremonies. In fact, you'll see a lot of people that can even speak the language and carry themselves in a quote-unquote Indigenous way, and yet still maintain an Aboriginal perspective to their politics. And that's one thing that we began to understand in the Native Youth Movement, was that there's an agenda that's been going on since the 50s that wants Canadians to understand Indigenous people as Aboriginals. And I want to make this distinction really clear right now, is because Aboriginal, of course, is a government name that refers to something that was made up in the Constitution, Section 35.1, that talks about non-status Indians, and Métis people. It's a legal distinction. And it's completely different than what we're talking about here, Indigenous solidarity. Because to be Indigenous today, as we understand it, or as we've grown to understand it, is to stick to your principles, to live a certain way, to understand that we've got an obligation to the land, and to understand that we've got an obligation to the people that live on the land. Which is why when you see things like Oka, things like Burnt Church, all of those different fights, all of those people don't run around saying, I'm really happy to be an Aboriginal in Canada. They run around saying, I'm proud to be an Indigenous person in occupied territories. And we now understand that agenda is fully funded. I think there's some glaring things that need to be addressed, even on the Aboriginal side, and that's missing and murdered women, that's deaths in custody, and that's the way that this state continues to steal our children.